Welcome to the Ben Wood Johnson podcast. You can visit Dr. Johnson's blog at benwoodpost.com. Dr. Johnson's works can be found at drbenwoodjohnson.com. You can also support Dr. Johnson on Patreon, the link to which is in the description. Hey, welcome back to the Ben Wood Johnson podcast. Today is September the 23rd, 2019. This is podcast number 38. I'm glad to have you back. I am glad to have you back. It's been a couple of weeks. But anyway, I'm back. Today we're going to pick up the pace. We're going to pick up where we left off. We're going to talk about education. But we're going to change philosopher. Over the last few weeks, we've talked about John Dewey and his approach to education, particularly when it comes to experience in education. Today, we're going to talk about Jean-Jacques Rousseau, as he's always referred to in my corner, Gigi Rousseau. I remember in high school, I had a professor who used to call him Gigi Rousseau, and he would really like Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Mr. Alain, that was his name. Anyway, today we're going to be talking about Rousseau and his philosophy. Of course, we are not going to delve into Rousseau. I recently published a book about Jean-Jacques Rousseau. It is titled Jean-Jacques Rousseau, a collection of short essays. So if you want to learn more about Jean-Jacques Rousseau, if you would like to learn more about my take on him, grab a copy of this book. It is currently available on all the major online retailers, so if you want that book, you will find it. In any case, today we're going to delve into Jean-Jacques Rousseau, into how he understood the world, but we will focus particularly on his understanding of education. So this is going to be an interesting podcast. Of course, we're not going to linger on Rousseau. This is going to be just one podcast on him. Like I said, if you'd like to learn more, grab my book, and I highly recommend this book. In any case, if you'd like to learn more about Jean-Jacques Rousseau, you are in the right place. So today we're going to talk about how he viewed education, how he viewed philosophy, how he viewed morality in man. So without further ado, let us delve right into it. In the world of contemporary philosophy, few names stand out as that of Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Now, Jean-Jacques Rousseau was a well-known thinker. He was particularly known as a political theorist. He wrote several books, essays about politics, about society. Rousseau is famous for his diatribes about the social contract. Still, the persona remains an enigma to most. So today, in this podcast, we are going to talk a little bit about Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Now, who was Jean-Jacques Rousseau? Now, first of all, we have to understand that Rousseau lived in France. Although the popular assumption is that Rousseau was French. But Rousseau was not French. Rousseau was born in Geneva, Switzerland on June 28, 1712. Nonetheless, he died in France on July 2nd, 1778. Aside from his intellectual talents, Rousseau was a composer, but he was mostly known as a writer. Now, Rousseau was considered someone who had a major influence on the Enlightenment of Europe. He had written several works which had a tremendous response from the public. And, Rousseau was he was a famous writer. He was a famous person even when he was alive. Even though Rousseau was known as a political theorist, his works extended beyond politics. In fact, Rousseau had produced works in various fields, including politics, economy, and education in particular. Okay, So Rousseau sort of built himself gradually. But Rousseau hit fame around 1750. He was about 38 years old when he became famous. And this was in part because of the work he produced about the arts and science. Actually, the work itself was titled The Discourse on the Arts and Science. So in this work, Rousseau argued that science and the arts are going to contribute to corruption of morality. He argued that sciences are particularly poisonous to the human mind, particularly when it comes to morality, to ethics. He argued that the value, the intrinsic value of men, is eroding. Or at least is going to erode even further as a result of science. One could argue that Rousseau was right, because the more the sciences have evolved, the less men sort of recoil to the age of incivility, to the age of immorality. Somehow Rousseau saw a connection between the sciences and the arts and morality. So this is to say that Rousseau was not only a political theorist or a political essayist, he was also a moralist. So he wrote extensively about the role of ethics in society, about how the value of a man is based on his moral virtue. In 1754, Rousseau produced another work. This work, though, he didn't attract as much attention as the previous one. But in this work, Rousseau sort of talks about inequality amongst men. In fact, the work was titled The Discourse on the Origin of Inequality. Now, some have argued that this work, although it wasn't as popular as the previous one, allowed Rousseau to become the philosopher or the great thinker that so many people seem to think that he was. Rousseau talks about the degree of inequality, the origin, if you will, of inequality among men. He talks about two kinds of inequality. He talks about the what he called like natural and physical inequality, and he also talks about moral or political inequality. Of course, we could argue that there's not much of a difference between the two, but Rousseau sort of delineates those two as to what we do as individuals, at least from an individual standpoint, and what we do when we function as a collective. Okay, one of the most famous works Rousseau produced was about political economy. Some of Rousseau's works include publications about social contract and political economy. So Rousseau sort of, placed himself on the pinnacle of some of the great thinkers in human history. But of course, that doesn't mean that everybody agrees with Rousseau. There are dissenting views. There are dissenting opinions as to the valor of Rousseau as a thinker. The degree to which what he was saying makes sense. So Rousseau was not always seen as somebody who discovered the essence of life. In other words, Rousseau's words were not golden, at least not to everybody. So there were those who disagree with what he had to say. But one thing that most people would not disagree with is the notion that Rousseau sort of participated in consequential moments in human history. For instance, it is believed that Rousseau influenced the French Revolution and the American Revolution as well. So Rousseau is credited to have had a major impact on thinkers such as Karl Marx, Hegel, Immanuel Kant, just to name a few. But Rousseau is well known as a person who contributed enormously to philosophy. In this particular series about philosophy, we are interested in education. Of course, we could talk about Rousseau in other fields, and I think in subsequent podcasts, we will talk about Rousseau a little deeper when it comes to other subjects, especially when it comes to social contract and political theory. But for today, let us focus on Rousseau as far as education is concerned. Because as I mentioned in the beginning, Rousseau was also an educational philosopher. What that means is that he wrote extensively about education. One of the most famous works Rousseau completed about education is the work titled Emile, or On Education. This work places Rousseau as an authority in education, but Rousseau had a particular understanding about what education is, what it should be, who should be part of it. Rousseau understood that education is an important pillar of any society, but he believes that education must involve the individual as much as the collective. So education is not, as it is today, the collective. At least some individuals decide what education is or ought to be. So from Rousseau's vantage point, education is inclusive. It should take into account the individual and the collective. At least it should take into account the needs of the collective and the needs of the individual. So Rousseau understood that education is an important path for both societal development and individual progress. Okay, so Rousseau believes that education must make it possible for the individual to thrive in society. So education must be a mechanism, a means for the individual to progress, okay, to develop himself. Of course, as we have discussed in previous podcasts, the concept of education is one of the mysteries of literature. Right? A lot of people talk about education, but not many people understand what it means, or what does the concept mean. There's always misunderstanding as to what is an education, who has it, who should have it, what the purpose of education is, what such a purpose should be. Now, of course, we are not going to delve into this aspect of the debate in this podcast, but this is to say that Rousseau had a clear understanding as to what education is or what it should be. From his perspective, education ought to be a way for the individual to be himself. Education is important for the individual as much as it is important for the collective, but it must be a mechanism for the individual to experience growth, or for the individual to find himself in the world, to discover himself in the world in the process. In the work Emile, Rousseau sort of put the individuals in the forefront of the debate. He argues that nobody was born with titles in society. Those are things that we acquire as we evolve in the social milieu. Morality is also important. Sort of there's this connection between, education and morality in the individual. So education is supposed to be this mechanism which allows the individual to learn about the world in such a way that the individual is able to construe his own morality, to put it this way. So Rousseau believes that educators should teach, at least should transfer skills, knowledge to the individual. Those skills and knowledge would in turn allow the individual to seek intellectual independence. That intellectual independence would sort of become the guide for the individual in terms of his understanding of morality and political values. So Rousseau argues that education is important. It is the period which the individual is malleable intellectually. So education is supposed to allow the individual to find the path, at least the necessary path, to make himself a valuable member of society. And making himself a valuable of society requires the individual to have intellectual independence, which would allow the individual to have a sense of what is right and wrong in society. Of course, we could argue that this is not the case. Education these days is somewhat the opposite of what Rousseau was saying. Nonetheless, we've talked about this in previous podcasts. It is irrefutable that there is a problem with education the way it is structured today. It is irrefutable that education today is leading to the malaise or to the doom of the individual, or the collective for that matter, instead of allowing the individual to reach a level of enlightenment where the individual is able to look around and see things for what they are and not what he is being told that they are. Education is sort of like an indoctrination. Of course, you could argue what is the difference between what Rousseau was saying and what is being done today in terms of indoctrination. But the bottom line is this. Rousseau was sort of arguing that the individual, at the end of the day, has the control, has the power over what his education is or ought to be. The the person educating another is only there to teach skills and knowledge. Now, what the individual does with the knowledge is up to him. Basically, that's what Rousseau was saying. In today's environment, yes, knowledge skills are also being taught to the individuals, but what the knowledge is, or what those skills are, and how to understand the knowledge of others and the skills of others are also being taught to the individual. In other words, the individual within the educational system these days does not have an intellectual independence. There are few who could stand and say, I am an independent thinker. Today, if you do not do things according to a certain worldview, you're not going to do things at all. And that's one of the reasons I refuse to be part of this crowd. I refuse to be like so many others are. I refuse to let myself be according to somebody else's understanding of what I should be. Rousseau was saying the same thing. He thought the individual ought to be independent in his way of thinking. The individual ought to be independent because, after all, most of the things I've talked about in this podcast makes him unorthodox to some people, right? You may say, well, this guy is saying a bunch of things that I don't usually hear other people say, right? Now, that doesn't necessarily mean I speak gold when I talk in my podcast, but it is the intellectual independence. I speak what I think is happening in the world. I speak my mind in terms of what I understand about the world, and there's nothing wrong with that. You may disagree with what I am saying. You may have questions as to the rationale, the logic of most of the things that I've said so far in my podcast, but you shouldn't, or you couldn't, or it wouldn't be, you should not deny me the right to speak those things, because that's what intellectual independence entails, that I have the independence. I have the freedom or the perception thereof to speak my mind, to say things the way I see them. I'm not guided by somebody's understanding as to what I am saying. Now, you might ask, what is the purpose of you making these podcasts? Are you trying to influence others to see things the way that you do? Now, the answer is no. These podcasts are intended to share my understanding of the world with you. You could accept or reject what I have to say. If what I have to say happens to make you see the world a certain way, that is your choice. It is your intellectual independence. Of course, when I speak about choice, I'm cautious as to what that means. The idea that somebody has a choice. I have reservations as to what that means. But what I'm trying to say is that you make of what I say what you want to make of it. I am not trying to force you to see the world the way I do. I believe that I do have intellectual independence. I believe that I do see the world differently from most people. And I believe that this is good for me. This is good for my psyche, because I know that I am not part of a chorus repeating things that everybody else is saying. But it is a way to share my views. It is a way to share my understanding. And Jean-Jacques Rousseau was saying something similar. The individual has to be able to speak his mind. He has to be intellectually independent. That is going to allow him to form an understanding of the world that is virtue, that is moral at its core. We couldn't say the same for most people today. Most people that are the product of our educational system, and I'm not talking about a particular country, they are what we usually say in French, at least in Creole, Jacques répète, meaning they sort of repeat what was said to them, and sometimes they don't understand. It's always fascinating to hear so-called philosophers or thinkers speaking, in every sentence they tell you what somebody else said. The guy is a thinker, but every sentence he uttered, he's referring to somebody else, something somebody else said. So you can see that he's not thinking for himself. He's repeating what other thinkers were thinking. And we have so many of those in our educational system today. We have so many of those in our world today. And to these people, I don't really waste time listening to them. I like an original thinker. I like somebody who is speaking his mind, who is telling me what he thinks the world is. Of course, what he's saying could be the reflection of what he was taught, how he was raised and whatnot. Again, that's another debate. debate, but on the outset, I like to listen to people talking about what they think the world is, not what they think others would agree that the world is, because the world is not necessarily what others think that it is. In fact, more often than not, the world is not what others think that it is. You have to be able to look at the world with your own eyes. You have to be able to look at the world from your own understanding and come up with your own conclusions as to what's going on, what is the world. And Rousseau will tell you that is an independent thinker, that is an independent intellectual, and that must be the result of education. Now, if you would like to learn more about Rousseau in terms of education, I just published a book about him. This book is titled Jean-Jacques Rousseau, a collection of short essays. It is available on Amazon and other online retailers. Feel free to grab a copy. It is a relatively short book, but it sort of summarizes Rousseau in terms of his philosophy, his worldviews, and what he thinks the world is supposed to be, and what the world is coming into. And I have bad news for you. Rousseau was right. We live in a world of decay, and Rousseau sort of predicted that world. He predicted the rise of science, of the science and the arts as a reaction. At least he predicted the rise of the science and the arts, and he also predicted the decay of morality among men. And that's what we're seeing these days. The concept of ethics, morality is sort of a word that people say and it doesn't really mean a thing. They say, this guy is moral, this guy is ethical, but for the most part, it doesn't mean a thing. You're going to look around, you're going to see that the same individual is doing something or believes in something that is equally immoral. So, you can tell that there's a certain intellectual prostitution going on, and as far as what so many people think about the world is. Again, if you want to learn more about Rousseau, my take on him as a philosopher, just grab a copy of this book. Like I said, it is available on major online retailers. It is titled Jean-Jacques Rousseau, a collection of short essays. So grab your copy today. So again, Jean-Jacques Rousseau was a major thinker. He had a major influence on so many things. What he saw, what he predicted about the world in terms of morality, in terms of politics, in terms of social contract, in terms of education, he was right. And if you want to learn more, grab a copy of my book today.